Hello, my name is Ren, and today is Flipbook Day. We're going to be creating this 2D side-scrolling character using Unreal Engine's Paper 2D tools. We're going to be creating flipbooks out of sprite sheets, one for idle, one for run, one for jumping, and one for landing. So without further ado, let's get started. First thing you want to do is import your texture. So I've imported this one here. We'll go to Sprite Actions and apply the Paper 2D settings. When we open this up, we'll see that we've got various animations in here, and we want to cut all those out into separate images to create flipbooks from. So what you can do is you can right click that again, go to Sprite Actions and extract the sprites. Now sprites can be extracted automatically based on whether their alpha is set up correctly. If this doesn't work for you, you can go to Grid and set this up how you like. So you'll have to get the right settings inside the cell width and cell height underneath the grid settings to get that to work correctly, but because mine's working automatically, I'm just going to extract all of them. So from here we want to create a walk and a jump and a crouch animation. So I'm going to select a couple of sprites from here to create a run. Now if I create a flipbook from these by right clicking them, create a flipbook, we'll call that run. And I open it up, we've got the frames at the bottom which show us which frames are playing. We've got a frames per second at the top right, and if we slow that down we can see a little bit more of what's happening. So it's missing a frame somewhere in the middle. So what we can do is under these drop down arrows on the right hand side, we can insert a frame. Now you'll see down the bottom left the second frame is now missing information. So we're going to select a sprite from there, and we're going to select the 9th sprite from it. What I've done here is scrolled through the timeline, picked the sprites that I'd like. So I've got 4 sprites here, and when I press play you got a little simple running animation. We can save and close that. Now what we want to do is create the falling animation. We've got a nice image here of him with his mouth wide open, so we'll create a flipbook from that, and we'll call it fall. This only has one frame, but that doesn't matter because it's just for when he's falling through the air and he'll be moving anyway. So another thing we want to do is the landing and crouching just before you jump animation. So we'll call this jump underscore land. And it's the same thing again. We have a single sprite which is going to be transitioned to in our character when we want to do a landing or a jump animation. So the last thing we want to do is a simple idle animation. So we'll take 2 sprites. We'll take this sprite 10 and we'll take the one where he's looking at the camera. And we'll create a flipbook from this. We'll call it idle. Now you'll notice that straight away he's transitioning between the 2 of those. We can pull on the right hand side of an individual sprite to make it longer. So what I'll do is I'll make both of these quite long, and I'll also change the frames per second to be a little bit slower. You can also right click on any of these sprites and duplicate them. We can scroll along this timeline. We can also drag sprites to change the order. The frames per second to 1, which means that these frames will last quite a long time. And now we can save that. The next thing we want to do is set up our inputs for our game mode. So if we go to Settings and Project Settings, and go to our input panel on the left hand side under Engine, you'll notice here that I've already got a jump and a move right set up. Now action mappings and axis mappings are the 2 options that we have. Actions are based on keys being pressed down or released. You can also set up Shift, Control, Alt and Command keys to be pressed at the same time to activate this input. And this will call jump inside our controller. So our jump's currently set up with various keys. We've also got axis mappings. Now axis mappings can be thought of as joysticks because they'll always relay an input, either positive, negative or idle. So at the moment we're using the A key as the negative input and the D key as the positive input. So this means that when move right is positive, he'll move to the right. When move right is relaying the A key, it's a negative input, so we'll move to the left. So if we close this, and we'll create a new blueprint. If you right click inside the content browser and create a new blueprint class, you'll see you have various options. There's also an all classes drop down where we'll be finding our paper characters. So there's a preset here for paper character. We're going to select that and create a new character. So we'll name this our new character. You'll notice when you open this up that there are some things already set up for us. The capsule component is the collision that the character has. We can change the height and the width of this. We have an arrow component to tell us which way is the front. We also have an inherited sprite. So in this sprite we're going to select our idle. So there's our idle character. So he's already playing his animation. One of the things we want to make sure is if we click on the top left here and select front viewport and also click on wireframe and set it to lit, we want to make sure that our sprite is at the bottom of our collision volume. So if we select the capsule component, make sure that the height is the same as the width, and we can move the sprite now. So we're just going to align that straight to the bottom and we'll save this. If we enter the event graph now, we'll notice that there are three options already. We have options for when the actor is overlapping other objects. We have an event tick, which is called every frame in the game, and an event begin play, which is called when the actor is spawned in. So we won't be needing the event begin overlap, and the tick function we'll leave for later. Right now we want to be looking at inputs, so we made input jump. And if you remember, this is based off a key being pressed or unpressed. We've also got an input for move right. So if we right click and type move right, we'll notice that we have an axis value, which will be positive, negative or 0, and a pin to draw off different functions. First we'll be creating the jump. Because the paper class is extending a preset class inside Unreal, jump is already sorted for us. We can also stop the character from jumping when the key is released. If we look at the input axis for move right, we'll know that we've got an axis value of positive 1 or negative 1 based on which key is being pressed. So if we compare this to 0 by typing compare float, dragging the pin in, typing 0 in the compare with field, we'll be offered a couple of pins. If it's more than, we'll be going to the right. If it's less than 0, we're going to the left. And if it's equal to 0, we know we're idle. We'll be using this to control which flipbook is being played. So one thing we're also going to need now is some variables. Variables can be declared over on the left hand side. We're creating a boolean for whether we're moving left or right, and a boolean is just a question. It's is something true or is something false. We'll set this to true if the value is positive, and false if the value is negative. Because we're using a default character, we'll be able to add movement inputs straight away. So this is a preset node as well. We're going to want to add this movement input based on which direction the character is moving, and we're always going to be wanting to move him in the x-axis. So we'll set x-axis to 1, and we'll use the scale from the axis to tell us which direction we're going. So before we move on to creating the game mode, we're going to need to create a camera. If we go to the viewport, we'll see that our character is just here. We want to add a component, and first thing we're going to add is a spring arm. Now this acts like a boom, like any regular camera, so we'll call it boom. We'll also rotate it to where we want it to be. Now it's facing our character. We also want to add a camera to this. So we'll add a camera, and we'll child this to the boom just by dragging it underneath it. We'll also want to face it in the same direction. One of the things we want to do for 2D games is set this camera to orthographic. We're going to set our view distance to 2048. Now we should be able to compile this and set up a game mode which will spawn our character in. In the main directory we'll create a new folder called game mode, and in here we'll create a new blueprint. Now this blueprint is going to be a game mode, and this is one of the defaults, so we can select this straight away. We'll call this our first game mode. So inside this game mode on the right hand side you can see which classes are being called when the game starts. So the one that we're interested in right now is the default pawn class. We're going to be using our new character. So if we save this and go back to our level, and we'll see that there's a world settings dialog box on the right hand side. If we click on this, there's a game mode drop down and there's a game mode override. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our first game mode. So now that we've selected our first game mode, we should be able to press play and our character will drop in. You'll see that he's not using any flipbooks right now, but he is able to jump and he is able to move around. So the next thing we need to do is to change the flipbook which is currently being animated. So if we open our character again and go to our event graph, one of the things we're going to want to do is create variables for each of these flipbooks. So let's do that now. I'm going to shorthand flipbook to FB and have one called idle. And on the top right hand side we can set what type of variable this will be. So the one we're interested in is a flipbook. So when I type in flip, you'll see that paper flipbook comes up, and I can set this to a paper flipbook type. And when I compile this, I'll get an option in the default value for what flipbook to use. So if I select idle, be able to set that. And if I click the little magnifying glass, I can find it and make sure it's the right one. It's this one just here. So inside our character, we're going to set up a few more. You can rename variables by right clicking and renaming them. What we can do is select which one of these to play based on what inputs are being pressed. So one of the things we can do to manage that is create a function. Functions are created similarly to how variables are created by adding a new function. So we'll call this set Flipbook. Functions can have inputs and outputs, which can be seen on the right hand side. For example, we can have an output of whether something is true, and we can pull off of this and branch based on that and start doing things. We can also have an output. So for example, the output could be a string, and we could set that to type string. And we could have various outputs based on whether something is true or not. Now for this example, I'm going to delete those. We're going to be switching the animations based on what state the character is in. So a good way of managing this is to create a state machine. Back in our content browser, if we right click and go to blueprints and create an enum, this will allow us to list our various states of animation that our character is going to be in. So we'll call this anim states 2D. When I double click that, we'll be able to create a new state. So the first one is going to be idle. Our second state is going to be whether he's running. Another state is going to be whether he's falling. And our last state is going to be whether he's getting ready to jump or landing. You can have various other states based on whether he's shooting, taking damage, flying. You could have any sort of states you want, and then you can switch on those inside your character. Now that we've done that, we can create a new input, and we'll call this next state, because this is where we're going to be setting the flipbook. So the next state is going to be equal to an anim state. Anim states 2D. We're also going to want to have our own variable of this called current state, and we'll set the variable type for that over here. If we compile that, we'll notice that in the drop down we've got those 4 options. Now we can set this state based on what the next state is going to be. Once we've set that state, we can set which flipbook that our sprite is going to use. So if we drag the sprite from the left hand side, pull off of it and set its flipbook, you'll notice that we have a little dialog box here which will allow us to select one. From here we can drag off, and if we type select, we'll be able to select from various different inputs. So those inputs are going to be our idle, our run, our land and jump, and our in-air states. Now if you control click and drag on those, you'll be able to pull them out. So I've control clicked and dragged these out into my blueprint. And now if I plug in our current state, it will give us the options for every single state within that enum. So I know that if I'm idle, I can use this animation, I can use the run animation, I can use the jump and land animation and the in-air animation. So now our sprite's going to change every time we call this function with the next state inside it. It's going to set the current state, and then it's going to switch off of it and pick a flipbook and set that on the character. And then we can return from there, and that's everything done. All we have to do now is call those functions. So if the key is pressed and we call jump, this may return false based on whether the character is already in the air or not. So what we want to check is whether or not the character can jump. So if we type that in, we have a boolean that's set up already for us. We can hold down B and click inside the blueprint to create a branch, or we can drag off of the return value of this boolean and type in branch. And from here we can branch off of whether or not we can jump. So once we've got this branch, if it's true, we want to set our flipbook to be jumping. And once we've done that, we know that we'll be in the air, which means that a couple of seconds later we want to be falling. What we're going to do is we're going to hold D and click inside the blueprint to create a delay, and we'll delay for 0.1 of a second, and then we'll play our falling animation. If we want to be extra careful on what happens here, we can do another branch asking if the character is falling. So if the character is falling, we can branch again. If this is true, we can set the animation to be falling. Now that's everything for the jump. If we drag over this and press C, we're able to put a comment on this. So we'll call this the jump controller. We'll move this jump controller out of the way. We'll drag a comment box over here and call this move input. And that's those two parts complete. The next thing we need to do is set the run or idle animation based on whether we're moving forwards, backwards, or whether we're not moving at all. Now, to manage these checks, we'll create a new custom event by typing custom event into the graph, and we'll call this animation update. Now, the first thing we needed to do was check whether or not the character was falling. So if we type in is falling, another part of the character movement component is this boolean set up for us. So we'll branch off of this, and if falling has already been set by the jump function, then we don't need to set it again, so true doesn't matter. But if we're not falling, what we want to do is set our flipbook to whether or not we're idle. So to do this, we can get the velocity of the character. So if we get the velocity, and we'll take the length of this, that will give us a single value based off of the vector. Now we can check whether or not that this is more than 0, and if it is, it means that we're moving. So if we set flipbook and drag off of this pin and type select, we'll be able to select an option based off whether we're moving or not. So if we're not more than 0, it means we're either 0 or less, so we're idle. If we are more than 0, then we're running. So if we connect this up to the false node, now this reads, if the character isn't falling, he's on the ground, and therefore let's check his speed. Is he idle or is he running? And then it sets it. So we'll call this our idle and run controller. Another thing that we're going to need to do is set whether or not our character is looking to the left or right. To do this, we can take our velocity again, and if we click on that and press Ctrl W, we'll be able to duplicate it. We can also right click and split this pin, so now we have the X value. If we take that X value and compare it to 0 again, we'll be able to find out whether or not we're moving to the right or to the left. If we create a custom event for this, called direction, and drag that in, we can start doing functionality over on the right hand side, which rotates the sprite left or right. One of the ways that we can do this is by setting the control rotation. So if we get the controller for this character, we'll be able to do things like set control rotation. The controller can be thought of as a persistent controller for you as a player. When you enter a game, you'll always have the same controller, but this character that we're coding right now, you may switch between this character and another character, but the controller will always be the same, and that'll be unique to you. So this controller is currently controlling this character, and we're going to set its rotation to be equal to 180 degrees or 0 degrees in the x-axis based on whether they're moving left or right. So if we split this struct pin, and we'll keep this at 0 for when we're moving forward, but we'll flip it 180 degrees in the yaw when we're moving to the left. The reason that we set is moving right earlier is so that when we're not moving, we know which direction we were last facing. So if we branch off of here and branch off of is moving right, if we were moving right, will be 0 rotation, and if we're not moving right and therefore moving left, we'll set the negative rotation. So that should be it for the directional movement. If you comment this out, call this direction flip. The next thing we'll need to do is call these two custom events that we've made. So in the event tick, which you can think of as an update function, it happens every frame, we'll call direction, and we'll also call animation update. Now because we're flipping the control rotation, our camera is going to rotate with it, so we don't want that to happen. With the inherit yaw, we can tick this on the right hand side after clicking on the camera boom, and stop it from inheriting the yaw of the controller. Now I've skipped ahead a bit here and added in a landing. The event on landed is another function of the character movement, and we're setting our own boolean called just landed. In the update that we had previously, where we'd check whether we're moving or not moving and setting the flipbook, we've added another branch for whether we've just landed. So when this just landed becomes true, and this update gets called on tick, it runs through, it sets the landing for 0.1 of a second, and then sets it back to false again, which means it will run back through and become idle. Now with these simple branches and questions based on whether we're moving or not moving and which direction and whether we're falling, if we press play, we'll notice that our character is now setting the flipbooks based on which state the animation is in, and we can also move around, jump and land. And based on this simple theory, we can create as many states as we want. We can fly, we can jump, we can swim, and we can fire weapons or pick up objects. We can do all sorts of interactions within the world based off simple flipbooks using 2D sprites and some question-based coding. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you go ahead and make some really cool flipbooks. In the next session we're going to be looking at pickups and interactions within the world, as well as animations within Unreal Engine's Blueprint editor. Thanks very much.